Case 1. The founders were against slavery. The story every American classroom repeats is that the founding fathers were reluctant slaveholders at worst, enlightened men who privately hated the institution and were quietly working toward the day it would end. The reality is that a great many of them built their entire fortunes on human beings they bought, sold, and worked for life. George Washington held more than 300 people in bondage at Mount Vernon. James Madison owned the plantation he was raised on. But if you're looking for the worst of them all in terms of slavery, Thomas Jefferson, the author of All Men Are Created Equal, is your guy. His story begins in 1787 while he was living in Paris as the American minister to France and sent word back to his Virginia plantation that his 8-year-old daughter Maria should be brought across the Atlantic to join him. Because the girl was far too young to travel alone, the household chose an enslaved teenager to accompany her, a girl they described in their letters as a careful Negro woman. Her name was Sally Hemings, and she was 14 years old. With a polite phrasing left unsaid was that Sally was the half-sister of Jefferson's own late wife, since both women share the same father, a Virginia planter who had taken Sally's enslaved mother as his concubine, and Jefferson had inherited Sally as property when that man died. The moment Sally arrived on French soil, she was, under French law, legally free, as was her older brother James, who was in the same city being trained as Jefferson's chef. Rather than let either of them understand what the law offered, Jefferson listed Sally on his papers as a paid chambermaid to disguise her status, and it was around this time, as the record shows him buying her unusual quantities of clothing, that historians place the beginning of a sexual relationship between a 44-year-old man and a girl of 14 that was his wife's sister. When he prepared to sail home, Sally agreed to return to slavery only after he promised that their children would one day be freed, and she was already pregnant when she boarded the ship. For the next 4 decades, she bore him at least 6 children, and he entered every one of them into the same farm book where he counted his livestock, never once acknowledging them as his own, showing them none of the warmth he poured onto his white grandchildren. When Jefferson died on the 4th of July in 1826, he freed only 5 of the more than 600 people he had owned, and Sally was not among them. Case 2. Washington had wooden teeth. Almost everyone grows up believing that George Washington spent his whole life with a mouthful of wooden teeth. It's a strange little detail that somehow makes the great father of the nation feel humble and human, a powerful man quietly putting up with an uncomfortable set of dentures. The wooden part is simply not true, and the real story is much harder to hear. When researchers examined a set of his dentures that still survives, they found they were made from gold, ivory, lead, and actual human teeth, and some of those teeth had come out of the mouths of the people he kept as slaves at Mount Vernon. In 1784, Washington sat down with his account book and wrote a line recording a small payment to Negroes for 9 teeth. His dentist, a French man known for buying human teeth, would pay full market rate whenever he bought them from free people. But the 9 teeth taken from the enslaved men and women at Mount Vernon cost only a fraction of that price. Washington took those cut-price teeth, pulled from the mouths of the people he owned, and wore them inside his own jaw for years. But the darkest story isn't about his teeth at all. It's about a young woman named Ona Judge, born at Mount Vernon, who served as Martha Washington's personal maid while the family lived in Philadelphia. Washington had run into a problem in that city because the law in Pennsylvania set enslaved people free if they were kept there longer than 6 months. So the president came up with a quiet trick, sending his enslaved household back to Virginia every few months and then bringing them back again, over and over, just to keep them from ever reaching the 6 months that would have made them free. Then Ona found out that Martha planned to give her away as a wedding gift to a granddaughter known for her temper, and she made up her mind to leave. One evening in May of 1796, she served the Washingtons their dinner, waited for the right moment, slipped out a side door, and got onto a ship heading north to New Hampshire. Washington did not let it go. He put ads in the newspaper, offered a reward, and sent a man after her, first to talk her into coming back, and then to drag her home by force along with her baby. A kind official warned her just in time, and she disappeared into hiding. She was never caught. Years later, someone asked if she was sorry she had traded an easy life in the president's house for years of being poor but free, and she answered simply, "No, I am free." Case 3. Benjamin Franklin was a kindly old genius. Benjamin Franklin is the founding father everyone loves. He's the smiling old inventor with a kite and key, the charming grandfather of the Revolution, the wise face smiling out from the $100 bill. He feels harmless, he feels good. And then, in the winter of 1997, a team of workers renovating his old London home dug into the ground beneath the garden and found something that brought the police straight to the door. Buried in a hidden pit under the floor were more than 1,000 pieces of human bone. They came from at least 15 different people, and 6 of them were children. Every single bone carried the marks of surgical tools, cut and sawed with care. The police opened an investigation, and tests soon showed that the bones dated back to the middle of the 1700s, the exact years Franklin had been living in that very house. The bones were traced to a man named William Hewson, a young surgeon who lived in the same house and who happened to be running a secret anatomy school out of it. The bodies he cut apart had been dug up from fresh graves by criminals known as body snatchers, who smuggled the corpses through the dark along the river and delivered them to the house where Franklin slept. Historians who have studied this are almost completely agreed on one uncomfortable point, which is that Franklin almost certainly knew. Hewson was his close friend, a man he had personally helped rise in the scientific world, and the school full of stolen bodies was operating in Franklin's own basement while Franklin lived upstairs. Case 4. The founders were united. The picture we're handed is one big brotherhood, a room full of wise men who set aside their differences and came together to build a nation with one shared dream. The reality is that these men often despised each other, and the ugly, personal, backstabbing politics America still lives with today is something they invented themselves. The worst of it was the war between 2 men in George Washington's own cabinet, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. They hated each other almost from the moment they met. Hamilton was sure Jefferson was a dangerous radical who would wreck the country, and Jefferson was sure Hamilton was secretly trying to bring back a king, and each one quietly believed the other was a traitor. So they went to war in the shadows. Jefferson, while sitting in the cabinet and drawing a government paycheck, secretly paid to keep a newspaper alive whose whole purpose was to tear Hamilton apart. Hamilton fought back by writing attack after attack on Jefferson in the papers under fake names. None of it about real policy, and all of it meant to do as much personal damage as possible. Washington spent much of his presidency practically begging the 2 of them to stop, and part of the reason he walked away rather than run again was that the fighting inside his own cabinet had worn him down. The nastiness reached a level that is hard to imagine even now. When Jefferson's allies dug up proof that Hamilton had been having an affair with a married woman, they threatened to use it against him. To prove he had not stolen government money, which was the more serious charge, Hamilton made a stunning choice. He sat down and published a long pamphlet confessing every detail of the affair himself, blowing up his own marriage and his own good name in public just to dodge the accusation of corruption. Case 5. The founders were too honorable for violence. In the last story, these men tore each other apart with poison pens, fake names, and whispered scandal. It's like Trump versus the Democrats nowadays. Yet back then, the feuds did not always stay on the page. On the morning of July 11, 1804, 2 founding fathers were rowed across the Hudson River to a quiet dueling ground on the cliffs of Weehawken, New Jersey. One was Alexander Hamilton, the former Treasury Secretary who had built the country's whole financial system. The other was Aaron Burr, the current vice president. The 2 had hated each other for years, and it finally boiled over when Burr ran for governor of New York, and Hamilton spread vicious personal insults about him that ended up printed in the newspapers. Burr demanded that he take it back. Hamilton refused, and so Burr challenged him to a duel. The pistols they carried up the hill were soaked in the family's blood already, because they were the very same pair used 3 years earlier in the duel that killed Hamilton's own 19-year-old son Philip, shot defending his father's honor on that exact patch of ground and left to die slowly in a bed between his parents. The guns even had a secret trigger setting that made them fire at the lightest touch. When Hamilton's second asked if he wanted it switched on, Hamilton answered, "Not this time." He had already decided to throw his shot away and fire wide as a show of honor. Burr had made no such decision. His shot tore through Hamilton's liver and lodged in his spine, and Hamilton was carried back across the river to suffer for 31 21 hours in front of his family before he died. What happened to Burr afterward is almost hard to believe. A grand jury in New York charged him with murder, and so did the authorities in New Jersey. Yet Burr was still the vice president, so he simply went back to Washington and calmly kept running the United States Senate while under indictment for killing a man. He was never tried and never spent a day in prison. A few years later, he turned up at a wild scheme to raise his own private army and carve out a personal empire in Mexico. That idea arrested him for treason against the country he had just helped govern. Yet, he walked free from that too. For the rest of his long life, he never showed a shred of regret, joking again and again about "my friend Hamilton, whom I shot," and dying an old man in a New York hotel room in 1836. Case 6. The founders loved democracy. We're raised to believe that the founding fathers handed the world its greatest gift, a true democracy, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, where every ordinary citizen finally held real power. The uncomfortable truth is that many of these men were terrified of exactly that idea, and they built the whole system to keep regular people at arm's length from power on purpose. To the men in the room, the word democracy did not mean freedom. It meant danger. They looked back at the ancient world and saw crowds turning into mobs, and they were sure that letting common people rule directly would end in chaos. John Adams wrote that democracy never lasts long, that it soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. And James Madison warned that real democracy had always been a spectacle of turbulence and contention. So they built a wall around power instead. On May 25, 1787 in Philadelphia, they wrote the Constitution behind locked doors and shut windows so the public could never hear what was being decided about them. Only white men who owned enough property were allowed to vote, a tiny slice of the country. Ordinary people were not trusted to choose their own senators, who were picked by the state politicians, and they were not trusted to directly choose the president either, a job handed to a special group of electors standing between the public and the decision. Alexander Hamilton even stood up and argued that the president and the Senate should serve for life, which sounded to many in the room like quietly rebuilding the very kind of king they had just fought a war to escape. The country they created was never really meant to be a democracy, and some of the bars they welded into place are standing in that same spot right now.